Title: Snoop Dogg disguises himself as a homeless person to test the police. What happens next is crazy. Snoop Dogg, disguised as a homeless man, exposes shocking police bias in Central Park. Watch the jaw-dropping encounter that's shaking the system. Like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on this bold experiment in social justice. The park was quiet that afternoon, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant hum of city traffic. Snoop sat on a weathered blue bench near the fountain, his hood pulled low over his face. His coat was patched and frayed at the edges, looking like it hadn't seen a washing machine in years. A crumpled brown paper bag rested beside him, and his mismatched, worn sneakers peeked out beneath the hem of his jeans. He didn't look up when a police cruiser slowly rolled into the park's parking lot. Two officers stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel as they surveyed the scene. One of them, a younger officer with a buzz cut and a badge that gleamed in the afternoon sun, adjusted his belt as he exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Higgins, a stocky man in his 40s with a tired expression and a coffee-stained uniform. Another vagrant, the younger officer, Officer Martinez, muttered, nodding towards Snoop on the bench. "This park is turning into a homeless camp. Let's just see what he's up to," Officer Higgins said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe he's harmless." The two officers approached the bench, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. Snoop didn't react, his gaze fixed on the ground as if he hadn't noticed them. "You can't sit here all day," Officer Martinez said sharply, his tone clipped. "This is a public park, not your living room." Snoop finally looked up, his eyes partially hidden under the shadow of his hood. He said nothing, his expression unreadable, and reached into the paper bag beside him. Officer Martinez tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the baton at his hip. "Easy," Officer Higgins murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's not escalate this." Snoop pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and began unwrapping it slowly, his movements deliberate but not threatening. He took a bite, chewing quietly as if the officers weren't even there. "Did you hear me?" Officer Martinez snapped, stepping closer. "I said you can't sit here all day. You got somewhere to go." Snoop swallowed his bite, his gaze flicking to the officer briefly before returning to his sandwich. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Just eating my lunch." "That's not the point," Officer Martinez shot back, his tone growing harsher. "People like you make the place look bad. You scare off families, tourists." Officer Higgins sighed again, crossing his arms as he watched the exchange. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gruff but less aggressive than his partner. Snoop hesitated, his fingers tightening slightly on the sandwich. "Calvin," he said finally. "Calvin Broadus, huh?" Officer Martinez smirked, clearly unimpressed. "You a rapper in your spare time?" Snoop didn't respond, his expression remaining neutral as he took another bite of his sandwich. His silence seemed to irritate Officer Martinez further, and he stepped closer, looming over the seated figure. "Let me see some ID," he demanded. Snoop set his sandwich down carefully, reaching into the pocket of his coat. He pulled out a worn leather wallet and handed it to Officer Martinez, who flipped it open with a practiced motion. The ID inside looked legitimate, though it bore no resemblance to Snoop's current disheveled appearance. Officer Martinez frowned, scrutinizing the ID before handing it back. "What are you doing here, Broadus?" he asked. "Why aren't you at a shelter or something?" "I like the fresh air," Snoop replied simply. "Is that a crime?" Officer Higgins shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner. "He's not doing anything illegal," he said quietly. "We can't just kick him out." "Maybe not," Officer Martinez muttered, his eyes narrowing. "But we can make it uncomfortable for him." Snoop's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his sandwich again, taking another slow, deliberate bite. The tension between him and the officers crackled in the air, drawing the attention of a few passers-by who slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued. "Hey," a woman walking her dog called out hesitantly. "He's not hurting anyone. Why are you bothering him?" Officer Martinez turned toward her, his face hardening. "Ma'am, this is none of your concern. This is a public park," the woman shot back. "It's also his right to be here as much as anyone else." Officer Higgins stepped in, raising a placating hand. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. Please move along." The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on her dog's leash as she glanced between Snoop on the bench and the officers. Finally, she shook her head and continued walking, muttering something under her breath. Snoop watched her go, a flicker of something, amusement? Annoyance, passing across his face. He set his sandwich down again, brushing crumbs from his lap. "Am I free to go?" he asked, his tone calm but with a subtle edge. "You're not under arrest," Officer Higgins said, though his partner shot him a warning glance. "But you might want to find somewhere else to sit." Snoop nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Officer Martinez for a moment longer than necessary. Then he stood, picking up his paper bag and tucking it under his arm. He was tall, taller than either of the officers had realized, and as he adjusted the hood of his coat, a lock of dark hair fell across his forehead. "Have a nice day," he said, his voice low but pointed. Officer Martinez watched him go, his expression darkening. "You see the way he looked at me?" he muttered to his partner. "Guy thinks he's better than us." "Let it go," Officer Higgins replied wearily. "He's not worth the paperwork." As Snoop walked away, his steps slow and measured, the tension in the park began to ease. But something lingered in the air, an unspoken challenge, a spark of defiance that hadn't been extinguished. But Officer Martinez wasn't so quick to let go. His mind raced, piecing together the small details that had seemed off, the way Snoop had spoken, calm and calculated, like he wasn't afraid of them, the way he had sized them up with a single glance, the way he had walked away, tall and deliberate, like a man used to being in control. It didn't sit right with him. Part 2. The tension builds. As Snoop disappeared down the path, the paper bag still tucked under his arm, Officer Martinez couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He turned to his partner, his frustration bubbling over. "I'm telling you, there's something off about him," he said, staring after the figure as if trying to memorize every detail. "He's hiding something." "Drop it," Officer Higgins replied, pinching the bridge of his nose. "He's gone. No harm done." "No harm yet," Officer Martinez shot back. "You saw his ID. It looked real, sure, but who carries around a wallet like that when they're dressed like him? And what's he doing in this park anyway? It doesn't add up." Officer Higgins shrugged, already turning back toward the cruiser. "Not our problem," he said. "We're not here to solve riddles. We're here to keep the peace." "He's hiding something," Officer Martinez muttered, his jaw tightening as he climbed back into the cruiser. His partner sighed but didn't argue, knowing better than to waste energy on what he saw as the kid's paranoia. Meanwhile, Snoop had made his way to a quieter part of Central Park, settling on another bench beneath a cluster of old oak trees. The paper bag rested beside him once again, untouched, as he leaned back and closed his eyes. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable, but there was an air of purpose about him, like a man waiting for something, or someone. It didn't take long for his solitude to be interrupted. A pair of joggers approached, their sneakers crunching on the gravel path. They slowed as they passed, their conversation trailing off as they noticed him sitting there. One of them, a middle-aged man with a sleek fitness tracker and a look of mild disdain, nudged his companion and muttered something under his breath. The woman beside him glanced at Snoop on the bench, her expression tightening into one of discomfort. "Should we call someone?" the man whispered, his voice carrying just enough to reach the ears of the person they were talking about. "He looks sketchy." Snoop opened his eyes, his gaze flicking to the joggers briefly before returning to the sky. He said nothing, his face betraying no reaction, but the tension in the air thickened. The joggers exchanged a look before picking up their pace, their footsteps fading as they hurried down the path. It wasn't long before another interruption came. This time, it was a group of teenagers on bikes, their laughter loud and carefree as they weaved between the trees. One of them spotted Snoop on the bench and slowed to a stop, gesturing for his friends to follow. "Check this out," the boy said, grinning as he pointed at Snoop. "Yo, you homeless or something?" Snoop didn't respond, his expression calm as he watched the boy with detached curiosity. The teenager, emboldened by the lack of reaction, leaned closer, his grin widening. "You lose your house playing Fortnite or what?" His friends laughed, their voices a cacophony of jeers and taunts. One of them pulled out a phone, holding it up as if to record the encounter. "Say something for the camera, man," he said, his tone mocking. "Tell us your life story." Snoop finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "You should get going," he said, his gaze steady. "This isn't a place for games." The teenagers hesitated, their laughter faltering as they exchanged uncertain glances. There was something in his tone, something quiet but commanding, that made them second-guess their decision to stick around. But before they could decide whether to leave or push further, the sound of a police cruiser pulling up nearby drew their attention. Officer Martinez stepped out first, his eyes immediately locking onto the group. "What's going on here?" he called, his tone sharp. The teenagers scattered like leaves in the wind, their bikes kicking up dust as they pedaled away. Officer Martinez barely spared them a glance, his focus zeroed in on Snoop on the bench. "You again," he said, striding toward him. "Couldn't find another park to loiter in?" Snoop didn't move, his posture still relaxed as he regarded Officer Martinez with a calm gaze. "Is sitting on a bench against the law now?" he asked. The officer's jaw tightened, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "You've got a smart mouth," he said, stopping a few feet away. "I don't like smart mouths." "Good thing I'm not here to make friends," Snoop replied evenly. Officer Higgins joined his partner, his expression one of mild annoyance as he looked between the two. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Why are we back?" "I don't trust him," Officer Martinez said, his eyes never leaving Snoop on the bench. "He's up to something." "He's sitting on a bench," Officer Higgins said, exasperated. "Let it go." But Officer Martinez wasn't listening. He took a step closer, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. Snoop tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Lunch," he said. "Prove it?" Snoop raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He picked up the paper bag and held it out, letting Officer Martinez peer inside. The officer frowned, his suspicion deepening as he saw nothing but an apple, a sandwich, and a bottle of water. "You got something else on you?" the officer asked. "Something you don't want us to find?" Snoop set the bag down, his movements calm and deliberate. "I've got nothing to hide," he said. "But if you're looking for trouble, I'm not the one you'll find it with." Officer Higgins sighed, shaking his head. "Let him go," he said to his partner. "We've got better things to do." But Officer Martinez hesitated, his instinct screaming that there was more to this man than met the eye. He didn't know what it was yet, but he was determined to find out. Part 2 Analysis. In this section, the tension between Snoop and Officer Martinez continues to build. Snoop's calm demeanor contrasts sharply with Martinez's growing frustration and suspicion. The interactions with the joggers and teenagers add layers to the story, showing how Snoop's presence affects different people in the park. Part 3. The confrontation escalates. Officer Martinez's jaw tightened as he stared at Snoop on the bench, the weight of his suspicion pressing heavily on the encounter. His partner had already turned to head back to the cruiser, but he wasn't ready to let it go. Something about this man, his calm demeanor, his unshakable composure, set his teeth on edge. It was like the guy was playing a game, and Officer Martinez hated the feeling that he might be losing. "You're awfully calm for someone getting this much attention," Officer Martinez said, his voice low and sharp. "Most people in your situation would be a little more nervous." Snoop didn't flinch. "Most people aren't breaking any laws," he replied simply. "Are you saying I should be nervous?" The officer stepped closer, his hands still resting on the baton at his hip. "I'm saying you're acting like you've got nothing to lose," he said. "And that makes me wonder what you're hiding." "I've got nothing to hide," Snoop replied evenly. "You've searched me. You've searched my bag. If you're still looking for something, that's on you." Officer Higgins, standing a few feet away with one hand on the cruiser door, sighed heavily. "Come on," he called to his partner. "He's not doing anything. Let's move on." But Officer Martinez ignored him, his eyes narrowing as he studied Snoop in the hooded coat. "You've got an answer for everything, don't you?" he said, his tone laced with irritation. "You think you're smarter than me?" Snoop tilted his head slightly, his gaze unflinching. "I'm not trying to prove anything," he said. "I'm just sitting on a bench." The officer took another step closer, the tension between them thickening. "You think you're clever," he muttered. "You think you can just sit here and make me look like an idiot?" "I think you're making yourself look that way," Snoop said softly, his voice calm but with an edge that cut deep. Officer Higgins stiffened, turning back toward the scene. "Enough," he said firmly, stepping between his partner and Snoop on the bench. "We're done here." But Officer Martinez wasn't ready to back down. "No, we're not," he snapped, his frustration boiling over. "This guy's playing us. I can feel it." "Feel it all you want," Officer Higgins said, his tone sharp. "You don't have anything on him. Leave it alone." For a moment, it looked like Officer Martinez might argue, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. But then he stepped back, his hand reluctantly dropping from his baton. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "We go." Snoop on the bench said nothing, watching silently as the officers turned and walked back toward their cruiser. But as Officer Martinez reached the car, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. His eyes met Snoop's for a brief moment, and in that instant, an unspoken challenge passed between them. In the cruiser, Officer Higgins shook his head as he started the engine. "You've got to let this stuff go," he said. "It's not worth the trouble." "It's not about trouble," Officer Martinez muttered, staring out the window. "It's about respect. That guy thinks he's untouchable." "He's not," Officer Higgins sighed, pulling the cruiser onto Central Park's main road. "Just let it go. We've got better things to do." But Officer Martinez couldn't let it go. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more frustrating than the last. Who was this guy? Why did he act like he had nothing to fear? And why did it feel like he was hiding something, even though there was no evidence to prove it? Back on the bench, Snoop watched the cruiser disappear around the corner, his expression unreadable. He reached into the paper bag beside him, pulling out the sandwich he had started earlier. As he unwrapped it, his gaze flicked briefly toward the cluster of trees nearby, where a man in a gray hoodie stood watching him. The man in the hoodie stepped forward, his movements cautious but deliberate. He stopped a few feet from the bench, glancing around to make sure they weren't being watched. "How's it going?" he asked, his voice low. Snoop took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully before replying. "About as expected," he said. "They're suspicious, but they haven't figured anything out yet." The man in the hoodie nodded, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Think they'll come back?" "They always do," Snoop said, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Curiosity gets the better of them." The man in the hoodie hesitated, his brow furrowing. "You sure about this?" "You're pushing them pretty hard." "That's the point," Snoop replied. "I want to see how far they'll go." Nearby, a jogger paused to tie their shoe, their eyes flicking toward the two men briefly before they continued on their way. The man in the hoodie stepped back, his posture tense. "Just be careful," he said. "If this goes sideways—" "It won't," Snoop interrupted, his voice calm but with a quiet authority that left no room for argument. "I've got this." The man in the hoodie nodded reluctantly, retreating back into the trees. Snoop took another bite of his sandwich, his gaze returning to the path ahead. He didn't have to wait long before the familiar hum of the police cruiser reached his ears again. Officer Martinez was back. Part 3 Analysis. In this section, the confrontation between Snoop and Officer Martinez reaches a boiling point. Martinez's frustration and suspicion grow, while Snoop remains calm and composed, further unsettling the officer. The introduction of the man in the hoodie adds an element of intrigue, hinting at a larger plan at play. Part 4. The Truth Revealed. The familiar hum of the police cruiser drew closer, the sound blending with the rustling leaves and distant chatter of Central Park. Snoop didn't move, his posture relaxed as he finished the last bite of his sandwich. His paper bag, now empty, rested neatly beside him. But his calm demeanor betrayed none of the sharp awareness in his eyes as the cruiser slowed to a stop nearby. Officer Martinez was out of the car before it had fully come to a halt, his steps brisk and purposeful as he approached the bench. His older partner, Officer Higgins, followed at a slower pace, his expression one of mounting frustration. "You again," Officer Martinez said, his tone sharp. His gaze darted to the empty paper bag before flicking back to Snoop's face. "Didn't we just have this conversation?" Snoop looked up, his expression neutral. We did, he said evenly. I didn't realize sitting on a bench was grounds for a second visit. Don't get smart with me, the officer snapped, his hand resting on his hip. You're still here, still acting suspicious. I don't know what your game is, but I'm going to find out. Officer Higgins stepped in, raising a hand to his partner. What are you doing? He asked, his voice low but firm. We already cleared him. He's up to something, Officer Martinez insisted, his eyes never leaving Snoop on the bench. I can feel it. That's not how the law works, Officer Higgins said, his tone tinged with exasperation. You can't just hassle someone because you feel like it. Then why is he still here? Officer Martinez shot back. Why hasn't he left? Normal people don't hang around like this. Normal people, Snoop repeated quietly, his voice calm but pointed. What exactly does that mean? Officer Martinez's jaw tightened, and he took another step forward. It means people who don't make a habit of sitting around parks, waiting for attention, he said. Maybe I just like the view, Snoop replied, his tone unbothered. Or maybe I don't feel like being rushed out of a public space for no reason. Officer Higgins sighed, his hand rubbing his temple as he glanced at his partner. You're escalating this for no reason, he said. Let it go. But Officer Martinez wasn't listening. He gestured towards Snoop on the bench, his frustration boiling over. If he's got nothing to hide, then he won't mind answering a few more questions. Snoop tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. What do you want to know? He asked. Why are you here? Officer Martinez demanded. Why this park? Why this bench? Do I need a reason? Snoop replied. I wasn't aware public spaces came with prerequisites. The officer's eyes narrowed. What's your deal? You're too calm, too calculated. People don't just sit like this unless they're planning something. Planning what? Snoop asked, his voice measured. A picnic? A peaceful afternoon? You tell me what crime I'm committing, and I'll tell you why I'm here. Officer Higgins stepped forward again, his patience clearly wearing thin. That's enough, he said, his tone firm. You've got nothing. Let's move on. But Officer Martinez refused to back down. He reached for his radio, his thumb pressing the button as he spoke. Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need a record check on an individual named Calvin Broadus. ID provided earlier. Snoop raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his expression unreadable as he watched the officer. The radio crackled in response, the dispatcher's voice coming through faintly. Copy that, Unit 12. Stand by. Don't try to play me, the officer snapped. You're not as clever as you think you are. Maybe not, Snoop replied. But I don't need to be clever to sit on a bench. The radio crackled again, cutting through the tension. Unit 12, no records found under the name Calvin Broadus, matching the provided ID. Officer Martinez stiffened, his hand tightening on the radio. What do you mean, no records? Officer Higgins groaned, throwing up his hands. You're making this into something it's not, he muttered. This is going to come back on us. Then he shouldn't have anything to worry about, Officer Martinez retorted, his gaze fixed on Snoop. If he's clean, he's clean. Snoop shifted slightly on the bench, leaning back as he folded his arms. You're very determined, he said. It's almost flattering. Exactly what it sounds like, the dispatcher replied. No matches in the system. Either the ID is fake, or there's an error in the database. Officer Higgins's face darkened as he turned to his partner. That's enough, he said sharply. We're not turning this into a witch hunt. Let it go. But Officer Martinez's suspicion only deepened, his frustration bubbling over into barely concealed anger. He's lying, he said, pointing at Snoop on the bench. That ID is fake, and he knows it. Snoop's gaze remained calm, though there was a flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, in his eyes. If that's true, he said, then why didn't you spot it earlier? The officer opened his mouth to respond, but his partner cut him off. We're done here, Officer Higgins said firmly, grabbing his arm and steering him toward the cruiser. Let him go before you make this worse. Officer Martinez reluctantly allowed himself to be led away, but his glare remained fixed on Snoop as they returned to the car. This isn't over, he muttered under his breath, slamming the door behind him. Snoop watched the cruiser pull away, his expression unreadable. Once again, he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small device that fit neatly into the palm of his hand. As he turned it over, a faint smirk crossed his lips. The game was unfolding exactly as he'd expected. Part 4 Analysis. In this section, the tension reaches its peak as Officer Martinez's suspicion leads him to call for a record check on Snoop. The discovery that there's no record of Calvin Broadus deepens Martinez's frustration and suspicion, while Snoop remains calm and composed. The introduction of the small device hints at a larger plan at play. Part 5. The Climax and Ending. The cruiser circled back to the parking lot, Officer Martinez gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white as his frustration boiled over. "I know something's off with this guy," he muttered, his eyes flicking toward the park paths, scanning for Snoop. "He's playing us, and I'm not about to let him get away with it." "Let him get away with what?" Officer Higgins shot back, his frustration finally bubbling to the surface. "Sitting on a bench? Eating a sandwich? You're acting like he's some kind of mastermind." "He might be," Officer Martinez muttered, pulling the car to a stop just near the cluster of trees where they'd last seen Snoop. Sure enough, he was still there, sitting calmly on the same bench as before. His hood was pushed back slightly now, revealing more of his face, though his posture remained relaxed, unbothered by their return. The paper bag beside him was now folded neatly, tucked against his leg as if to signal that he was finished eating. He looked up as the officers approached, his expression unreadable. "You boys miss me already?" he asked, his tone calm but with a faint hint of amusement. Officer Martinez stiffened, his frustration bubbling over. "We're not done with you yet," he said sharply, stepping closer. "That ID you gave us, it doesn't exist. Care to explain?" Snoop raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "Maybe your system's broken," he replied. "Or maybe you're just looking for something that's not there." "Don't get smart with me," Officer Martinez snapped. "I know a fake when I see one." Officer Higgins stepped in, his tone more measured. "We're giving you a chance to come clean," he said. "If there's something you need to tell us, now's the time." Snoop leaned back slightly, his posture still relaxed as he studied the two officers. "What exactly do you think I'm hiding?" he asked, his tone curious. "A secret identity? A criminal record? Or maybe a sinister plan to overthrow the local park bench economy?" Officer Higgins pressed a hand to his temple, clearly exhausted by the exchange. "Look," he said, "you're not making this easier on yourself. If you've got a reason for being here, just tell us. Otherwise, my partner's not going to let this go." "I think we both know that's true." Snoop nodded slowly, his gaze flicking to Officer Martinez. "You've made up your mind about me, haven't you? Nothing I say is going to change that." Officer Martinez stepped closer, his hand resting on his baton. "You think you're clever?" he said, his voice low and tense. "You think you can just sit there, acting like you're better than us?" "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Snoop replied evenly. "But I do think you've got something to prove." The words landed like a slap, and Officer Martinez's face flushed with anger. Before his partner could intervene, he stepped even closer, looming over Snoop on the bench. "You think this is a game?" he demanded. "You think you can just sit there and make me look like a fool?" "I think you're doing a fine job of that on your own," Snoop replied calmly. Officer Higgins grabbed his partner's arm, pulling him back slightly. "Enough," he said firmly. "We're not doing this." But Officer Martinez wasn't ready to back down. He gestured toward Snoop, his frustration spilling over. "He's hiding something," he said. "I know it. He's too calm, too confident. Nobody acts like that unless they've got something to hide." "Even if he is," Officer Higgins said, his patience wearing thin, "it's not our job to harass him until we find something. We don't have probable cause." "Drop it? Probable cause?" Officer Martinez repeated, his voice rising. "How about a fake ID? How about refusing to leave when we've asked him to?" "It's a public park," Officer Higgins said, his tone sharp. "He doesn't have to leave unless he's breaking the law. And so far, he hasn't." On the bench, Snoop watched the exchange quietly, his expression calm but observant. He seemed to be taking mental notes, cataloging every word, every movement, as if this were all part of a larger plan. The tension in the air was palpable as Officer Martinez approached the bench one more time, this time alone. His partner had finally had enough, refusing to be part of what he called an unnecessary vendetta. But for Officer Martinez, this wasn't about a vendetta. It was about control. About getting to the bottom of whatever Snoop was hiding. He strode toward the bench with renewed determination, his hand resting on his baton as he mentally rehearsed his next move. Snoop was still there, as calm and composed as ever. His hood was pushed back completely now, revealing more of his face. His expression was relaxed, but his eyes carried a sharpness that unnerved the officer. "You're going to regret this," Officer Martinez muttered, pointing a finger at Snoop. "Whatever you're up to, I'll figure it out." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into a faint smile. "I'm sure you will," he said. "Good luck with that." The words hung in the air, their calm defiance only fueling Officer Martinez's frustration. He turned and stormed back to the cruiser, his partner following reluctantly. As they drove away, Officer Martinez's mind raced, his thoughts consumed by Snoop on the bench. "He's playing us," he muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. "I know it." "Or maybe," Officer Higgins said tiredly, "you're just reading too much into this." But Officer Martinez wasn't listening. He was already forming a plan, determined to uncover the truth about Snoop on the bench, no matter what it took. Part 6. The Final Revelation. Back at Central Park, Snoop watched the cruiser disappear, his calm demeanor unshaken. He reached into his coat pocket again, pulling out the small device as he turned it over in his hand. A faint smile played on his lips. The game was far from over, and he was ready for whatever came next. "You've got some nerve," Officer Martinez said as he stopped a few feet away, his voice low and tense. "Sitting here, acting like you own the place." Snoop looked up, his gaze steady. "It's a public park," he replied. "Nobody owns it." "You know what I mean," Officer Martinez snapped. "You've been playing games with me all day, and I'm done. You're going to tell me who you really are, or I'll make sure you regret it." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into a faint smile. "You really want to know who I am?" he asked. "Enough with the smart remarks," Officer Martinez growled. "Let me see some real ID this time. No tricks, no fake names. Just the truth." Snoop reached into his coat pocket slowly, his movements deliberate. Officer Martinez tensed, his hand tightening on his baton as he watched every move, ready to react at the slightest sign of a threat. But Snoop didn't pull out a weapon or another questionable ID. Instead, he produced a sleek black smartphone, its polished surface catching the light as he held it up. "Here's the thing," Snoop said, his tone calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I don't need to prove anything to you. But since you're so determined to know the truth, I'll give it to you." He tapped the screen a few times, and a video began to play. Officer Martinez leaned in slightly, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The footage showed Officer Martinez himself, standing over Snoop earlier that day, his tone aggressive as he demanded answers. The audio was crystal clear, every word, every inflection captured in stunning detail. "What is this?" Officer Martinez demanded, his voice rising. "This," Snoop said, "is a live stream. It's been running all day. Every interaction we've had, every word you've said, has been broadcast to millions of people." Officer Martinez's face went pale, his grip on his baton faltering. What are you talking about?" Snoop stood slowly, his full height imposing as he faced the officer. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression calm but unyielding. "I'm not Calvin Broadus," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm Snoop Dogg." Officer Martinez blinked, his mind reeling as he tried to process the words. "What?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Snoop Dogg? You're kidding." "I never kid about things like this," Snoop replied, his tone even but carrying a quiet authority. "I've been conducting an experiment, testing how people like you treat those you perceive as less fortunate." Officer Martinez's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The calm demeanor, the confidence, the subtle but deliberate way Snoop had handled every interaction. It all made sense now, and the realization hit him like a freight train. "You set me up," Officer Martinez said finally, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and panic. "I didn't set you up," Snoop replied. "I gave you a choice. Every action you took, every word you said, was your own. All I did was observe." Officer Martinez's face turned red, his frustration boiling over. "You had no right," he spat. "You had no right to do this." "I had every right," Snoop said calmly. "You're a public servant, sworn to protect and serve. But instead of doing your job, you chose to harass someone you thought was beneath you." The officer took a step back, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. "You can't use this," he said. "This is entrapment. It's illegal." "It's not entrapment," Snoop said. "I didn't force you to do anything. And as for legality, my lawyers would be happy to explain why you don't have a case." Officer Martinez's panic deepened as he realized the full scope of what was happening: the live stream, the audience, the undeniable evidence. It was all too much. He had thought he was in control, but now it was clear that Snoop had been several steps ahead the entire time. Part 7. The Aftermath. Outside Central Park, a crowd had begun to gather. News crews were arriving, their cameras trained on the unfolding scene. Reporters whispered into microphones, their excitement palpable as they described the confrontation. Officer Martinez turned, his face contorted with humiliation as he realized they were here for him. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking as he pointed a finger at Snoop. "You won't get away with this." "It's already over," Snoop said. "The world's watching now." The younger officer's face was a mask of panic and rage as the weight of the situation bore down on him. His eyes darted to the growing crowd of bystanders, their phones raised and recording, and then to the approaching news crews, who were eagerly documenting every second. The sudden realization that he had gone from an authority figure to a public spectacle was suffocating. "You think this makes you a hero?" he spat, pointing an accusatory finger at Snoop. "Dressing up and playing games? You're nothing but a fraud." Snoop didn't flinch, his calm demeanor remaining intact even as Officer Martinez's words echoed across Central Park. "This isn't about me," Snoop said, his voice measured but firm. "It's about accountability. It's about how people in positions of power choose to treat those they think are powerless." "Powerless?" Officer Martinez barked, his voice rising in desperation. "You're Snoop Dogg, for God's sake. You're a celebrity. Don't act like you're some saint coming down from the heavens." Snoop raised an eyebrow, his expression unmoved. "Exactly," he said. "And yet you treated me like dirt the moment you assumed I was homeless. Imagine how you treat people who don't have the resources to fight back." Officer Higgins arrived on the scene, his face pale as he took in the chaos. He'd been following in the cruiser but hadn't anticipated the scale of what was unfolding. He grabbed Officer Martinez by the arm, pulling him back as he whispered urgently, "Stop talking. You're making it worse." "I didn't do anything wrong," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the noise. "I was just doing my job." "I'm not going to let him get away with this," Officer Martinez shot back, his voice trembling with anger. But his partner's grip tightened, and the warning in his eyes finally registered. "You already did," Officer Higgins said quietly, his tone heavy with resignation. "Just stop before you dig the hole any deeper." The crowd murmured, their voices a mix of disbelief and indignation. Words like abuse of power and disgrace rippled through the gathering, the condemnation growing louder with each passing moment. The news crews were now fully set up, their cameras zoomed in on the confrontation. Reporters were speaking animatedly into their microphones, their words broadcast live to millions. Snoop turned his attention to the crowd, addressing them with the same calm authority he'd shown throughout the day. "This isn't about one bad officer," he said. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It's about holding people accountable, not just for their actions, but for their attitudes." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound reverberating through Central Park. Officer Martinez's face flushed red, his humiliation complete as he realized there was no way to regain control of the narrative. He glanced at the cameras, the realization dawning that his every move was being broadcast to the world. "Your job is to serve and protect," Snoop said, his gaze sharp. "Not to profile, harass, or abuse your authority. And if you can't handle that responsibility, then maybe you shouldn't wear the badge. Officer Higgins stepped in again, his tone now pleading. "Let him go," he said. "We need to leave." But before they could retreat, another voice cut through the chaos, a commanding voice that silenced the crowd. "Officers, stand down." Everyone turned to see a woman in a crisp suit approaching, her presence exuding authority. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to take control of a situation. The badge clipped to her belt identified her as Captain Jane Monroe from the Internal Affairs Division of the NYPD. Officer Martinez's eyes widened as she approached, her sharp gaze locking onto him. "You've made quite a mess," she said, her tone cold. "I hope you're prepared to deal with the consequences." "Ma'am?" he began, but she held up a hand to silence him. "Save it," she said. "I've already seen the footage, and I think the public's made their opinion pretty clear." She gestured to the crowd, who were now openly booing Officer Martinez. Captain Monroe turned to Snoop, her demeanor softening slightly. "Mr. Dogg," she said, "on behalf of the department, I'd like to apologize for what you've been through today. This behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you, it will be dealt with." Snoop nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The woman nodded, turning back to Officer Martinez. "Hand over your badge and weapon," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "What?" Officer Martinez stammered, his face pale. "You can't be serious." "Do it," she snapped. "You're on administrative leave, pending an investigation. And trust me, this investigation will be thorough." Officer Martinez's hands trembled as he unclipped his badge and gun, handing them over with a look of utter defeat. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a mixture of triumph and relief as justice began to take shape. As Officer Martinez was led away, his shoulders slumped, Snoop turned to the cameras one last time. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's just the beginning. If we want to create real change, we need to hold people accountable, not just when they're caught, but every single day." The crowd roared their approval, their applause echoing through Central Park as the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. Officer Martinez, now stripped of his authority, was escorted away, his humiliation complete. The news crews lingered, some still capturing shots of the park bench where the day's events had unfolded. Snoop remained standing near the fountain, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his coat as though this were just another ordinary day. Captain Monroe returned to him, her expression still one of professional seriousness. "Mr. Dogg," she began, "I want to personally assure you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. The department doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior." Snoop nodded but didn't smile. "I hope so," he replied. "Because it's not about one officer. It's about the culture that allows these things to happen." She hesitated, clearly unsettled by the weight of his words. "I understand," she said finally. "And I'll make sure your concerns are heard." As she walked away, Snoop turned back to the bench, the faintest trace of a smile playing on his lips. He sat down again, pulling out his phone and scrolling through the live stream comments. They were pouring in by the thousands, expressions of outrage, support, and shock at what had unfolded. "This is exactly why we need accountability," one comment read. "Snoop Dogg just exposed a huge problem," another said. "This isn't just about one cop, it's about the whole system," another commenter pointed out. Part 8, the final message. Snoop's smile widened slightly as he typed a response to the flood of comments. "Change starts with awareness. Let's keep the conversation going." Nearby, an elderly woman who had been watching everything from the sidelines approached him cautiously. "I had no idea who you were," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But what you did is brave. You didn't have to do that." Snoop looked up, his expression softening. "Sometimes the best way to understand a problem is to experience it firsthand," he said. "And sometimes the only way to fix it is to shine a light on it." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Well, thank you," she said. "For standing up for all the people who can't?" Snoop nodded back, watching as she walked away. Nearby, the officers who remained on the scene were speaking with their superiors, their postures tense as they awaited instructions. Officer Martinez, now stripped of his badge and weapon, sat in the back of another cruiser, his head in his hands. His career, if not his entire life, was in ruins, and the weight of his actions hung heavily over him. Captain Monroe had already begun reviewing the live stream footage with a team of investigators, their expressions grim as they pieced together the chain of events. For Snoop, this was just the beginning of a larger effort to address systemic issues. He had no intention of letting this moment pass without action. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Central Park, Snoop stood and stretched. The quiet hum of a sleek black SUV pulling up to the curb drew his attention, and he smiled faintly as a young assistant stepped out, holding the door open. "Ready to go, sir?" the assistant asked. "Not just yet," Snoop replied, his gaze sweeping over Central Park one last time. He turned back to the bench, pulling out a pen and a scrap of paper from his pocket. Scribbling something quickly, he folded the note and tucked it under the edge of the bench. The assistant looked puzzled but didn't ask questions as Snoop finally approached the car. Before stepping in, he glanced back at the crowd, the officers, and the bench where it had all started. "This isn't just about me," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "It's about making sure everyone has a seat at the table, or the bench." As the SUV glided away, the note left behind on the bench fluttered slightly in the breeze. "To the next person who sits here, your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Part 9. The Aftermath and Moral of the Story. The crowd began to thin, but the conversation didn't stop. People spoke about what they'd seen, about the abuses of power and about the unexpected courage of a man who chose to challenge the system from a park bench. The day would live on, not just in the news but in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. For Snoop Dogg, the work was far from over. This was just one park, one officer, one moment. But every big change starts with a small spark. And as he leaned back in the SUV, scrolling through the thousands of comments pouring into his live stream, he knew one thing for certain. The spark had been lit. Moral of the story: power, whether given by authority or wealth, comes with responsibility. It's only when we hold ourselves and others accountable that we can build a world where dignity and respect are afforded to everyone, no matter where they sit. Part 10. The Legacy. As the news of Snoop Dogg's social experiment spread, the video of the confrontation became a viral sensation, sparking debates across social media, news outlets, and communities worldwide. People were divided. Some praised Snoop's bold approach to exposing systemic issues, while others questioned the ethics of the experiment. But one thing was clear. The conversation about accountability in law enforcement and societal biases had been reignited. Back in Central Park, life slowly returned to normal. But the bench where Snoop had sat became something of a landmark. Visitors stopped to take photos, some leaving notes of their own, inspired by the words Snoop had left behind. "Your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The simple message resonated deeply, particularly with those who had faced discrimination or felt powerless in the face of authority. For Officer Martinez, the fallout was immediate and severe. Stripped of his badge and weapon, he faced a public investigation into his conduct. His actions were condemned by both his superiors and the public. His partner, Officer Higgins, though spared disciplinary action, carried the heavy burden of witnessing how quickly unchecked bias could escalate into something far worse. He resolved to be more vigilant in his duties, vowing to ensure that such incidents wouldn't happen again on his watch. Meanwhile, Snoop returned to his work with a renewed sense of purpose. At a press conference days later in Times Square, he addressed the incident directly. "This wasn't about embarrassing anyone," he said. "It was about holding up a mirror to ourselves as a society. If we want to create real change, we need to start by looking at how we treat each other, especially those who have less than us." The crowd erupted into applause, and Snoop's words echoed far beyond the streets of New York. His experiment had sparked a global conversation, and the ripple effects would be felt for years to come.